So we are going to first on slide 13 examine the classical theory of money demand. And the classicals examine an equation called the Fisher's equation. And the Fisher's equation was developed by Irving Fisher. And in the Fisher's equation, he's saying that MV is equal to PT. What is MV? M is the supply of money in the economy. V is the velocity of circulation, which is the number of times that per year that a dollar would change hand or a dollar is used to buy goods and services. So M is the money supply, the amount of money in the economy. V is the number of times money changes hand or $1 is used to buy goods and services. He's saying that MV is equal to PT. P is the price level and T is the number of transactions. Now, basically what MV and PT, both MV and PT measure the total value of transaction during the time period and hence are identical. MV is basically the money that is leaving my hand and PT is the value of what I'm buying. So MV is equal to PT is saying that the money that is leaving my hand should be equal to the value of the transaction that is being sold to me. So the money that is handed over in a transaction is equal to the value of what is being sold. So because of that, the two is equal. MV is equal to PT. So if it is I'm handing over $5 for a bottle of water, which is MV, the money that's been handed over, that should be equal to the value of the bottle of water. So that $5 I'm handing over should be equal to the value of that bottle of water that I am buying. And like I said, this is called the Fisher's equation. So PT, we on to slide 14. PT is the total value of the transaction and MV is the value, the money that I'm handing over, the value of the money that's been handed over. So the value of the money that's been handed over must be equal to the value of what the transaction, the value of the transaction that is being purchased. Therefore, MV must equal PT because every time there's a sale or transaction, it will be equal to the value of the money change in hand. So every time I'm buying something, it will be equal to the value of what I am buying. So the two equations are said to be equal, right? On to slide 15. This identity is converted to a theory to determine price levels, and it assumes that the money supply is determined by the monetary authority, so the amount of money in the economy is determined by the central bank. The number of transactions is fixed in the short run. The velocity of money, which is the number of times money is changed in hands, is fixed. Therefore, the equation can be written as MV is equal to PT. So M is the money supply, V, which is the number of times money is changed in hand, that is held fixed, and that is why we're seeing a bar over it. P is the price level, and T is the number of transactions, that is also held fixed. Therefore, any changes in M, which is the money supply, will be brought about by what? Changes in price. So changes in M will be is as a result of changes in price. Why? Because V is held fixed and T is held fixed. So any changes in M is because of there's a change in price. In the same way, any changes in price is because there's a change in M. So on to slide 16. According to the quantity theory of money demand, which is examined by the classicals, according to the theory, money is held only for the purpose of making payments for current transactions. So they're examining why do people hold money. Money is held for transaction purposes, to make everyday payments or purchases. Therefore, the demand for money is called the transaction demand for money. So when the money supply increases, people find themselves holding more money. So when there's more money in the economy, we demand more money, right? And so they spend the excess. It is this extra spending that pushes up the price level. So when there's a lot of money in the economy, we find ourselves spending a lot more money. And as we spend money, prices would increase, right? And as prices rise, the value of transactions will also rise. So as prices rise, the value of what we are buying will also rise. And so the demand for money would also rise as well. So according to the classicals, people demand money for transaction purposes. And it is called the transaction demand for money. As there's more money in the economy, people spend more. As they spend more, prices rise. As prices rise, the value of transactions also rise, and therefore people demand more money. And this mechanism ceases when the demand for money is equal to the supply for money. Right? We are going to skip slide 17. This was just another way of explaining the Fisher's equation. It was a Cambridge version, but we're not going to be examining this Cambridge version, so we are moving on to slide 18. In slide 18, we are examining the Keynesian theory of money. Now remember, the classical theory examined the Fisher's equation, and they said that money is demanded for transaction purposes. But Keynes is saying money is demanded not only for transaction purposes, but for transaction purposes, precautionary purposes, and for speculative purposes. So Keynes is saying there are three main reasons why money is demanded. So and these three motives for demanding money is the transaction motive, precautionary motive, and speculation motive. Now, on slide 9, we are going to examine the transaction motive. So, Keynes is saying people demand money for the transaction motive. What is the transaction motive? The transaction motive is basically saying people demand money to finance their day-to-day purchases or their day-to-day transactions. The amount of money needed to make these transactions would depend on our income and our institutional arrangement, such as how frequently we get paid. Now, if our arrangement remain unchanged, then money income is the main determinant of the transaction demand. So therefore, we are saying the transaction demand, the fact that we demand money, is a function of our income. So where L is the transaction demand money. So the transaction demand for money, we demand money for transaction purposes as a function of our income. So the transaction motive is basically saying we demand money to pay for day-to-day purchases. And the amount of money we demand is based on our income and our institutional arrangement in terms of how often we get paid, right? So that's one reason why we demand money. The next reason we demand money is for precautionary motive. And that is basically saying that people hold money to safeguard against times of uncertain cash flow. So that's savings. You demand money to save just in case something happens. And this demand is also likely to depend on national income. So the amount of money you save is also dependent on your income. Now, the higher the total value of transaction, the more money will be needed to safeguard against total transaction. What is this saying? The more money you spend on a daily basis is the more money you need to safeguard yourself just in case something happens. So if on a monthly basis I spend $5,000, then it means I'm gonna have to have at least $5,000 a lot. So the more money you spend, the more money you would need in savings to take care of yourself in cases when something goes wrong. Now, the rate of interest may also affect your savings, which is the precautionary demand. However, for simplicity, we can assume that the precautionary demand does not respond to changes in interest, but instead in the function of national income. Therefore, when we refer to the transaction demand, it also includes precautionary demand. So this is saying when we talk about needing money for transaction purposes, we also talk about needing money for savings. So far, two reasons why we demand money according to the Keynesian theory: for transaction motive, which is day-to-day expenses, and for precautionary motives, which is for savings or to safeguard, protect ourselves against uncertain cash flows. And the last reason, according to Keynes, that's slide 21, why we demand money is for speculative demand. And when we talk about speculative demand, we are talking about investments. So people hold money as an alternative to holding assets. Now, when interest rates are high, people demand less money. So if you have a high interest rate, you would demand less money. Why? Because you want to save the money to get a higher return. And when the interest rate is low, we demand more money. So there's a negative relationship between the amount of money we demand versus the rate of return or the interest rate. So Keynes derived an inverse relationship between the interest rate and speculative demand for money. So as your interest rate increase, we demand less money. As the interest rate decrease, we demand more money. So on slide 22, Keynes examined the total demand for money, and that would increase. That is known as total liquidity preference. And the total demand for money is found by adding up the demand for transaction, the demand for precautionary purposes, and the demand for speculative reasons. And that would give you the total demand for money. So far we saw that classicals are saying we demand money just for transaction purposes. But Keynes is saying we demand money not only for transactions, but also for precautionary reasons and for speculative reasons, which is investment purposes. Now we are going to move on to examine a concept called the Keynes transmission mechanism. And this basically refers to the channel through which the effect of a change in one economic variable is transmitted to other variables. So it looks at when there's a change in one variable, how it transmits to affecting other variables. And it basically examines the relationship between the monetary sector and the real sector. Monetary sector, we're talking about the central banks, money supply. Real sector, we are talking about goods and services. So it shows us how monetary policy affects aggregate demand, how monetary policy affects the amount of the goods and services produced. And this mechanism it establishes the link between interest rates, investments expenditure, and aggregate demand. It basically shows us that a fall in the interest rate leads to an increase in investments. So once the interest rate falls, that leads to an increase in investments, right? And an increase in investments leads to an increase in aggregate expenditure and also in aggregate demand. So we are starting with the money sector there, monetary policy, and a fall in interest rate is a monetary policy. Whenever the interest rate falls, people would invest more because it becomes cheaper to borrow. And when it becomes cheaper to borrow, that's going to lead to an increase in investments. And that increase in investment increases aggregate expenditure. And once aggregate expenditure is increasing, it also increases aggregate demand. So a change in monetary policy has an effect on aggregate demand based on channeling through investments and increased aggregate expenditure. So an example on slide 24 of the transmission mechanism is an increase in the money supply, which is the amount of money in an economy from MS1 to MS2. So if the amount of money in the economy were to increase, this will lead to banks wanting to expand their loans. So if money supply increase, the banks are going to give out more loans and they would lower their interest rate. When they lower the interest rate, it becomes easier or cheaper to borrow. So this would lead to what? A rise in investments because people would want to expand their portfolio of investment and purchase other financial assets. The increase in the money supply would also lead to an increase in demand, causing the demand curve to shift outward. And the transmission mechanism is nicely detailed in the final slide, which is slide 25, showing us that a change in monetary policy would lead to a change in excess reserve. That is going to lead to a multiple change in the money supply, which means you have an increase in the money supply. An increase in the money supply would lead to a change in the interest rate, which is a fall in the interest rate. A fall in the interest rate will lead to a change in investment, which is an increase in investments. And an increase in investment would lead to a change in real GDP, which is an increase in aggregate demand. So we are seeing a change in monetary policy leads to a change in aggregate demand. And it is transmitted through all these mechanisms that we just examined. I hope, guys, you would have enjoyed the money lecture. We saw that money is any asset that is widely used and accepted as payment. We saw the functions of money, the types of money, the narrow definition versus the broad definition, the functions, the characteristics, classical theory versus the Keynesian theory of money, and the transmission mechanism. If there's anything that you did not understand, please do not hesitate to let me know. Send me an email, meet me during office hours, or post me a question. I am here to support you. I want to wish you a blessed week. Bye.